Bé, bona tarda o bona nit. Gràcies a tots per ser aquí, sí on sigui aquest aquí, en l'espai, en el temps, ara mateix, en el futur. Jo em dic Jordi Puntí i avui, per commemorar el dia Orwell, tindré el gust i la sort de conversar amb l'escriptor i periodista Dorian Lynskey. Abans de presentar-vos el convidat, però, deixeu-me dir que aquesta és una conversa que forma part dels actes del dia Orwell, que el CCCB organitza cada any des del 2013, conjuntament amb el PEN català i amb The Orwell Foundation. És un acte que vol celebrar la vida, l'obra i la influència de l'escriptor anglès. Com deia abans, aquest any un dels convidats és Dorian Lynskey. Alguns el coneixereu potser pels seus articles al Guardian, al Billboard o a l'Observer, que acostumen a situar-se en la intersecció entre el periodisme musical i l'anàlisi política i cultural. I potser també heu llegit el seu primer llibre, que es va traduir al castellà amb el títol de 33 revoluciones por minuto, història de la canción protesta. El seu últim assaig, que és el que avui ens convoca, no s'ha traduït al català o al castellà encara, però esperem precisament que aquesta conversa serveixi perquè algun editor espavilat s'hi animi. The Ministry of Truth, que és aquest títol, amb el subtítol The Biography of George Orwell's 1984, és un assaig fascinant que parteix d'una premissa que em sembla molt original, que és fer la biografia, podríem dir-ne, d'un llibre tan influent com 1984, des del moment en què George Orwell va començar a pensar-hi, el procés d'escriptura i fins a les reaccions de quan es va publicar. I encara fins avui dia, amb la vida que té gràcies als seus lectors, a l'actualització constant d'allò que vol transmetre. 1984 és un llibre que no s'esgota, això ja ho sabem. Al contrari, ens permet reflexionar sobre el present, 70 anys més tard de la publicació, i és sobre aquesta actualitat que també volem parlar amb Dorian Lynskey. So we'll start. Hello, Dorian.
Hi.
Okay, I'm going to start with an impossible question and probably the one that you will hate most, so we can get it out of the picture. We're coming out of a lockdown all over the world and facing an upcoming time of crisis and uncertainty. And we're also seeing a lot of demonstrations around the world in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. And as if it were not enough, the UK will have to deal with the effective Brexit in the next months. And so now the hideous question, how would Orwell react to all this? How do you think he would look at the huge death toll, for example, from the pandemic and the decisions of most governments that have been putting economic reasons before healthcare? You cannot answer if you want.
No, I mean, the thing is, you can't say, you can't say what Orwell would have thought. You can say what Orwell did think about various things. There was he had sort of aspects of kind of a disaster prepper, somebody who's kind of into stockpiling and becoming self-sufficient in case of a disaster. And obviously in his day, that was nuclear war when he was on the Scottish island of Jura, where he wrote 1984. He thought, well, if there is a nuclear war, then it's probably not going to come up here. There's a remote island, and I'm growing my own food. And his friends couldn't tell whether he was joking or not. But he was somebody that did like to he did sort of expect the worst and prepare for the worst. Mm-hmm. I mean, as for all the other things, you can only say what he thought of the perils of his time. That obviously something like Black Lives Matter he was ignorant about racism, but something like Black Lives Matter just didn't exist.
Yeah.
Although he was very critical of racism, he was critical of the British Empire. But I think maybe the larger question there is that recently in Britain we've had this issue about whether you should take down statues of slave owners.
I agree. Yeah.
And people call that Orwellian. And I think it's a simplification. It's when people have only read 1984, don't understand other things that he thought. And so I've become very reluctant to say what Orwell would have thought now, because I think so many people misuse him very dishonestly to sort of agree with them. And I know that Orwell, we'd agree on a lot, but not on everything. And he was quite unpredictable. And that's kind of why he's so exciting to read, because his ideas would change as events changed.
Let's move to another question, because I'm from a generation that read 1984 because we were in 1984, and suddenly Orwell was all the rage, and everyone was talking about him. And then there was also the movie adaptation. Let's start from, how about you? Can you tell us when you did start reading Orwell and his work, and what brought you to write about 1984 in such a deep manner?
I suppose I was maybe 13, and it just seemed like one of those books that, you know, in your early teens that you need to read. It really wasn't anything more than that, because it wasn't a particularly Orwellian time. You know, it was like the late 80s. It didn't feel particularly relevant. That wasn't why I read it. It just seemed like one of those books that you should read, you know, like Lord of the Flies or Clockwork Orange. And then as an adult, I kind of read more. I was younger, I read Animal Farm. And then as an adult, I got more interested in his essays, his nonfiction. And I got very interested in dystopian tropes, because so many people write dystopias now, and they're dystopian movies and dystopian books. And I got very interested in the sort of history of the dystopian idea. And as soon as you start looking into that, you realize that somebody else who was really interested in that, even though he didn't use the word dystopia, was Orwell. And so really that book, you can't talk about that genre unless you talk about that book. And Orwell himself was responding to lots of earlier examples. And then of course he influenced all the subsequent examples. So he's like this sort of, if you do like a diagram of dystopias, 1984 is in the center. And I'd had the experience, my first book, which was History of Protest Songs, is that sometimes songs that were so famous, I thought there was nothing interesting to say about them, proved to be the most fun to write about. Because actually when something is almost too famous, people take it for granted and maybe don't ask many questions about it. They just go, oh, it's just 1984. And so I thought, actually, as soon as you start looking into it, there's all these fascinating ideas and influences and ambiguities in the book and the story about how he came to write it. And then, of course, it seemed around the time I started, Trump was elected, and that the way that he kind of abuses truth seemed to give it this contemporary relevance. So it was a lot of different ideas coming together.
And so one of the many things actually that your book explore is all the inspirations, or perhaps in some cases even aggravations, that Orwell took from what he lived and read throughout his life, which is something that normally would happen to fiction writers, right? You take from what you live and what you read, and then you mix it. And as the CCCB is based in Barcelona, I guess we should start from here, from Barcelona, and from the homage to Catalonia. So can you tell us about what he saw in Barcelona during the Civil War that ended up, you know, surfacing as an influence in 1984?
Well, what happened in Barcelona sort of influenced 1984 and Animal Farm, because it was two very different cities, sort of a few months in between his visits there. So he arrives in Barcelona at the end of 1936, and 1936 had been this revolutionary year, a lot of trade unions and anarchist groups, and it was this and it wasn't just Orwell who noticed this. There were a lot of other writers, journalists who visited Barcelona during that time, and it was just this incredibly inspiring, exciting, liberated place for a few months in 1936. And Orwell thought, well, I've been looking for my socialist ideal, in somewhere away from the kind of English snobbery that he'd grown up with. And he found that in Spain. But when he returned to Barcelona in May, this particular time, that was when there was a kind of huge split between the left-wing group that he was a part of, the POUM, who were kind of former Trotskyist group, and the Stalin-backed, sort of the mainstream Communist Party. And basically there was a civil war within the civil war. And so what happened in May, so starting with the May Days unrest, was that there was a crackdown, and basically the communists tried to break POUM, the Trotskyists, the anarchists, but anybody that wasn't following the Moscow line. And Orwell and his sort of colleagues, his friends over there, were caught up in that. And there's some sort of debate about how much danger Orwell was, but he and his wife basically had to flee over the border to France. And the way that he describes in Homage to Catalonia the mood of Barcelona at that time, and again, this is supported by other writers who were there, it sounds like it's the mood of 1984. It's a mood of like fear and distrust and paranoia and not knowing who's going to turn on you and not knowing what's going to happen to you, and the feeling of being an individual caught up in this larger political struggle. And I think it was the contrast between the Barcelona that he'd seen when he arrived and what the city had become, from this kind of like almost sort of liberated paradise to a mini police state. That to him kind of summed up what had happened in Russia, the sort of betrayal of the Russian Revolution. And that, as he said later, that directly led him, some years later, to write Animal Farm and 1984, which are kind of like the two books go together. They're both sort of describing different parts of that process.
I see. So one of the many things that we realized through your book is that precisely 1984 doesn't stand alone, as you were saying, with Animal Farm, but also with a lot of very much of with the journalism. He's entangled with other books and with articles. So can you tell us, how did it work for him? Did he rehearse, for example, some of the ideas for the novels through the articles, like a sort of blueprint? Because that's something that strikes me
not even
very, very potential. In your book, that you managed to do a very well research work of finding what he said already before and how he changed also over the years, because this is, to me, one of the qualities also for Orwell, is that he's able to recognize the contradictions and the failures when he's not convinced of what he said, and he moves forward and he goes to another part. So, but I'm mainly interested in this, in how did he work both things, because it feels like, because he didn't have this huge imagination, he was working a lot from real life, and sometimes you feel like how you go from the articles to the fiction, keeping the same essence, let's say.
Well, so it's a long process, and if you look back to, say, 2 + 2 = 5, which is a famous idea.
Yeah, exactly.
In the novel, that you have to believe that 2 + 2 = 4 when the state is telling you 2 + 2 = 5. Now, that was something that he started, that he came across in a book about Russia in 1937. And he first used it himself in a book review a few weeks afterwards. That ends up in the novel over 10 years later. The famous image of the boot stamping on a human face forever. There's a lot of jackboots in Orwell's writing. There's a lot of rats in Orwell's writing, his fear of rats. So from small images to quite big ideas, about whoever controls the past controls the future. That's from an essay from 1942. So you see him kind of coming across a really resonant phrase and then thinking about the implications and rewording it and sort of finessing it. And what's kind of unique with Orwell is that all this stuff was published. So it's not like you really have to go through loads of notebooks like you would with most novelists, because he had to write to earn money. And so many of the ideas in 1984, you could have come across in a book review or an essay. And so it was this long process that really started when he came back from Spain. So it's over 10 years. And then at the same time, obviously, he was also taking ideas and images from the books he was reading and conversations he was having. So it's this really unusually well-documented creative process that leads up to 1984. I don't know of any other book where there is as much evidence of what he was thinking and how his thinking changed.
And would you say that his ideas were already you know, breaking some ice in the society were already having an impact, or he was a journalist who was, you know, he was not that well read at that time?
He wasn't,
Like 10 years before.
I mean, most of his books didn't sell very well. Poor Animal Farm, none of his books sold very well, except there was a pamphlet called The Lion and the Unicorn, which he wrote in 1940 to justify, to try and get socialists to support the war effort and go, even if you don't like Churchill, even if you don't like militarism, even if you don't like the British Empire, Hitler is worse, you know, and this is why it's worth fighting. And that actually did sell quite well. That's how a lot of people would have come across him. But he didn't have a huge success, but he was the literary and political world then was quite small. So if you look at, and he wasn't even that sociable, right? But if you look at the people that he knew, he encountered so many of the great novelists of the time, poets, labor politicians, writers from Europe that had fled Europe, you know, due to the war. He was very kind of connected to these people. So he was influential within a small circle, but your average reader would not have known who he was. And most of the time he was publishing in these really quite small magazines that had hardly any readers.
I see. And it seems to me that, you know, Orwell, always needed to be against something. That was his normal way of writing also, and that of course was also present in, you know, in the bigger world. So he was always writing probably against an idea, and I presume it was a political approach, of course. And one of the subjects that he needed to take on were utopias, and the wish for a better future that would come with utopia. So now that you were talking about friendship with other writers, can you comment on his relationship with H.G. Wells, and especially H.G. Wells' novels, even in a personal level? Like, how was he drawn to him? Was he an inspiration?
Well,
we feel always needed to be more away than close to him.
Yeah. So all had a habit of being quite critical, even of very close friends. That he would sometimes, you know, give bad reviews to books by his close friends, which is it takes a certain kind of person to do that. That's very unusual. And also not expect them to be angry about it. And to just think, well, I'm just being honest. And with Wells was so influential on him when he was younger, all the sort of the great science fiction novels. It was a huge influence on him, and sort of, he said, everybody of his generation, you know, that H.G. Wells helped kind of invent the modern world. But by the 1930s, Wells had become quite repetitive and out of touch. And he kept revising these ideas he had of these kind of sort of sensible utopias, which made for quite boring books. And also Orwell thought that Wells just didn't understand. He was so rational, he didn't really understand the irrational. And so he didn't understand the appeal of Hitler, for example. And so he came to think he was rather sort of clueless. And they did have dinner once in 1941, but they had a big argument because Orwell had recently, you know, written this very critical essay about him. But Orwell was kind of, again, unusual in that he could have huge admiration for somebody and then be fiercely critical of them. And a lot of the influences of 1984 became influences because he argued with them. So he didn't feel, it was almost a way not to be intimidated by them. He would just argue back and go, okay, there's something interesting here, but what if they got wrong? And that was sort of his creative engine, was disagreement.
So, and in your book, we also learned that Orwell's prophetic intuition, let's say, was kind of a disaster, right? And even Thomas Pynchon in his text that he wrote in a sort of a preface, he warned us about the differences between prophecies and predictions.
Right.
And Orwell wrote several articles sketching what would happen in the near future, and he usually was wrong, probably due to his gloomy and somehow pessimistic approach, could be. But yet actually he seems to have seen it all through his novel. like when his sort of predictions were the most radical and desperate, he did it right. He found it right, let's say. So where do you think these long visions come from?
I don't think he was. I don't think he was predicting things. I think he was describing. He was describing what had already happened, and imagining, and sort of just kind of dramatizing that, but in London, like and Britain and America and Oceania, basically in the West, and in the future. But most of the things that he describes are they're just exaggerations. They're sort of satirical exaggerations of things that had already happened. So when people say it's prophetic, or, you know, Orwell's fiction is coming true, it's like, well, that's because Orwell's fiction wasn't entirely fiction. It was taken from things that had happened, and he just pushed certain elements further and put them into the future. But you would almost write a version of 1984 which is set in Russia in the 1930s, and a lot of the same things would happen.
I see. Yeah. So when we read the first part of your book, it seems that 1984 is mainly a product of Orwell's time, as you say, very defined by the facts that he was living, and if it's not a prediction, it's now sort of how he projects them into the future. But on the second part, we realize that there's a timelessness to it, in the sense that there's an easiness to adapt to other times and events. This projection he did, it becomes very much at hand to understand other situations. Can you tell us a bit more about this? Why do you think this happened? Why do you think he found, I mean, maybe it's not the word find it right, but how do you think he managed to give us a work that would adapt so well to every different times and situations, and later on we will go to these other times and try to find why?
I mean, because he spent so many years trying to understand what had happened in Germany and Russia. And so he was interested in how they abused language, how they abused truth, how they commanded sort of mass obedience, how they treated dissidents, how they used war and kind of an outside threats to kind of pacify their citizens. And so he kind of learned all this stuff about totalitarianism from reading, from talking to people sometimes who had lived in these countries and even been imprisoned in these countries. So those things don't really change, but the technology changes, the kind of the vehicle, the vessels for this change. But power, you say that, you know, the kind of what people do to gain and retain power is quite consistent. But what changes is the technology. And so there are versions of surveillance or police informants going back to, you know, at least like the Spanish Inquisition. It's just they didn't have televisions and cameras in the Spanish Inquisition. And so he was always interested. He basically had a very good balance of what doesn't change, essentially, how people abuse power, and that's quite consistent, but also what did change and what new technology meant, and how to use the mass media and how to use cameras and so on. And so it was those getting those two things right, which means that you can apply it to all kinds of countries in all kinds of periods since, because in some way they will be behaving in some of the ways, not all of the ways. You know, there's not a regime that's as extreme as the one in 1984, but some of those things. And so you can't read it without being reminded of so many different things since.
The thing is that what you were saying made me think of, I was thinking now about other dystopian novels, and they sometimes get right one thing, or they get right a couple of things, but not in the way that Orwell does, that he gets right a lot of different things. And not only that, even if it's not a prediction, he, like, for example, the double screening, right? This is something that at 1949 it was very, very improbable. And what strikes me is how, like, starting in the 80s probably, how we suddenly realized that this was working, almost in a way that it's as if we were imitating the novel. You understand?
But it's quite, for him, it was quite logical, because when television was introduced, a lot of people felt quite nervous. They felt like if they could watch the TV could be watching them. Like this was a thing that
yeah, you tell about that. Yes.
So for Orwell, it was quite logical. He'd seen how totalitarians used radio. He wrote a lot about the use of radio, and of course he worked for the BBC in radio. So with the television just coming along, not many people had televisions when he wrote 1984, in Britain anyway. But he didn't take that much to think, okay, how might television be used to manipulate people? So I think to him, he would find that surprising that was prophetic, because I think he would have thought, well, this is kind of a logical extension of the TV. And actually, maybe because he didn't understand the technology, maybe if he did understand the technology and he was more of a science fiction author, he might have gone, oh, we don't have the technology for TVs to watch you back. That's too improbable. And he might not have done it. But because he didn't understand really the technology, he just thought, well, logically, as soon as it is possible, this will happen.
I think, yeah. Well, and probably the fact that he didn't rely a lot on his imagination made it more plausible for him to believe, right? In the sense that he was working from reality, or from a suspected reality, not from fiction, from fantasy.
But he was good at working out the logic. So in a sense, he was going like, because if you understand history, you have a better sense of where things are going in some ways. He could sort of, it's almost like there was a line and it stopped, in his day.
Yeah.
And then he just thought, but if the line just keeps going, how might a totalitarian state behave in the future? So I think it seemed quite logical to him. It's not these huge leaps. If you look at a lot of utopian, dystopian novels before Orwell, they're much wilder. They really do go off in these kind of, these sort of crazy scenarios. Many of which, have not come true at all. And so I think for him, he was always like, take reality and then just nudge it forward a bit, which is what something like Black Mirror does now. That's why Black Mirror is successful, because it's not wild science fiction. It's just reality plus one.
And following like this line that you were saying, would you say, like, for example, now you were also mentioning Black Mirror. Would you say that, for example, the success of The Handmaid's Tale in TV series is also related to this feeling that we are projecting the future, the real future? Because in fact, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that. Margaret Atwood wrote the novel in 1984 precisely, and actually it has a lot of relationship. I mean, connections with 1984, even in the form of writing.
Well, she was hugely influenced by Orwell when she was a child, and she's written about the impact that the Animal Farm in 1984 had on her when she was young, and the kind of epilogue to the appendix to Handmaid's Tale is kind of, which turns the whole book into a text, was kind of a tribute to her reading of the appendix of 1984. But there's also something in the texture of it where there's a lot of things that the main character doesn't know. The main character is keeping a diary, like Winston Smith in 1984. But there's also lots of things that they don't know. And so there's that sense of almost that sort of powerlessness, because you don't really know what's true and what isn't. But of course, what's so great about Handmaid's Tale is that Margaret Atwood is introducing all of these other things that would occur to a kind of woman in the 1980s. And so there's this whole other dimension to it. So it's in no sense a kind of rip-off of 1984, but it's sort of interesting that she made the influence of 1984 quite obvious. She didn't try and hide it. It was obviously a really big inspiration for her. And again, that idea of reality plus one, you just go a bit further. And she said that, there was nothing in The Handmaid's Tale that either that hadn't happened or was actually happening at the time in some country in the world. It's just when you put it in America, it seems more terrifying, whereas some of it was already happening in Iran, for example.
And that's the idea that there's always some war going on, right, in the back of this reality, like it happens in 1984 and like it happens in The Handmaid's Tale. There's always a war going on that maybe doesn't affect precisely the main characters, but it's the presence, and it's almost, and you can also have doubts about the reality of this war, right?
What you're being told, yeah.
But you was also there is something also that I think it's interesting to relate between Atwood novel and 1984, which is, you were mentioning it, the appendix, and how the appendix makes us, it's a special thing to end 1984 with this appendix about doublespeak and how it makes us think about the novel differently, and it makes us speculate a lot about what it means, all what we have read before.
Yeah.
And also, actually, I think that when Margaret Atwood does the same, in a way, I wouldn't say she's making us a easier path to understand. But probably that she does, right?
Well, this is Atwood's theory, and basically there's nobody can know what Orwell meant by the appendix, but the mystery of the appendix is that it refers to the events of the novel. It refers to Winston Smith, and it refers to the distant past, and it seems to be written by somebody after the regime, the Ingsoc regime, has fallen. Mm-hmm. But there's no other explanation. So therefore, some people like Margaret Atwood see that as a kind of hint that this is taking place, this is being written, that the regime did not last forever, it fell. And the appendix is being written by this kind of quite dispassionate academic sometime in the future. So in The Handmaid's Tale, that's exactly what she does. She almost kind of cleans up this idea and sort of goes, okay, the main text is definitely a first-person diary, and the appendix is definitely an analysis by academics in the future. And that, as far as I can tell, comes from her theory about what Orwell's appendix was. But lots of people have read that novel, probably most people have read the novel, without reading the appendix that way. They just go, oh, it's just an explanation of Newspeak. So it's a sort of mystery that there is no definitive answer to, because nobody ever asked Orwell. He died, Mm-hmm. If he'd lived a bit longer, and perhaps if one interviewer had said, what does the appendix mean? And then Orwell might have told him, oh, right, it means this. So yeah, that just shows how, that says something about Atwood's sort of intelligence as a reader, and also her imagination, that she could sort of take this idea and use it as the kind of structural foundation for The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, actually, I'd say after the dark ending of the novel, I think there's some readers who never go to read the appendix. Just leave it, just finish the novel where it was supposed to be, almost like if it was something different, like from another book, actually. And I learned in your book that the Americans tried to publish the novel without the appendix.
The book club, the Book of the Month Club, yeah.
Right, which would be also a very interesting way of reading it, and
probably
without
and also without Emmanuel Goldstein's book, which takes up a good chunk of 1980.
That's true.
And they just went, these things, they're too dense, they're too into, I think, what we would now call world building. You know, there's too much here explaining how this society works, and takes us away from the plot and story of Winston and Julia. And so you could do an edited version where you just remove that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And Orwell strongly resisted, because he thought they'd missed the point. They didn't understand that all this stuff was just as important as what happens to Winston and Julia.
Okay. Yeah. So let me go back to the beginning when the book is published in 1949. Sorry. Of course, people read it as a sequence coming from Stalinism and Nazism. Then in the early 60s comes the Cold War, which is something that a term that Orwell coined, with all the paranoia in the so-called free world. And can you tell us a bit about how it was read at both sides of the Iron Curtain? I remember you mentioned the Polish writer Czesław Miłosz saying that he read it as a sort of image or photography of the reality that he was living.
There's quite a lot of accounts of people living in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and so on, who read it, and it was the first book that they'd read that they felt understood what they were living through and almost explained back to them what they were living through. And one of them noticed the kind of weirdness of Winston Smith reads Goldstein's book, which is a secret banned book, and that explains the society he lives in. And 1984, which was a secret banned book, was explaining his society to him. So he felt almost that he was reading Winston, reading Goldstein. He was a character in the book.
Yeah.
And I mean, that to me is more interesting than I suppose, you know, for example, the CIA were somewhat involved in a movie of 1984. And they saw 1984 and Animal Farm as great kind of Cold War propaganda against Stalin's Russia. I mean, which it was really effective. But it's the kind of memories of the people who read it, who lived behind the Iron Curtain, and how they felt, and almost their emotional response to it, which to me sort of proves how powerful it was. Because if it's just propaganda, it's not going to move people to tears like that. It's not going to sort of transform their lives.
That's true. Yeah. And so then the 70s come, and suddenly there's chaos again, especially in the UK, in the political scene. The hippie movement, you know, and the flower power prefer to talk about utopias. But there are other artists like David Bowie or John Lennon who turn to Orwell for some kind of inspiration. If I may quote some lines that you use from an interview with Bowie that you transcribed, Bowie says, "I'm an awful pessimist. That's one of the things against me. I'm pessimistic about new things, new projects, new ideas as far as society is concerned. I think it's all over personally. I think the end of the world happened 10 years ago. This is it." Can you tell us about Bowie's project, The Diamond Dogs, from 1974? Because there's this song, which is called 1984, with these lines that seems to take aim at Bob Dylan, right? He says, "The times they are a-telling and the changing isn't free."
Right. Well, Bowie was very into, as a young man, he was very into science fiction, and he was very sort of pessimistic post-war British science fiction. And he was, you know, obviously that included 1984. And then he became increasingly interested in kind of totalitarianism, the kind of the threat of it, but also the allure of it. He became interested in sort of catastrophe. And Diamond Dogs he made after a long trip back from Japan. He didn't want to fly home, so he took the train through Russia and Eastern Europe, and he was kind of really shocked by what he saw. This was his sort of eyewitness.
So he went from Japan to with the Trans-Siberian.
Yeah.
Okay.
and, you know, stopped over in
Yeah.
Moscow for a night, you know, took the train through East Berlin, all of these things. So he became, it was almost like it was the science fiction part of his brain merging with actually what he was seeing for himself and sort of modern politics. And so Diamond Dogs is this, he wanted to make a musical version of 1984, either for stage or for TV. It's not quite clear. And he was refused permission, which isn't surprising, because Orwell's widow was very protective. And I don't think she'd have been interested in David Bowie.
Not at that time. Maybe 30 years later.
Maybe,
But
exactly. She was really protective because she didn't like the film that had been made in 1984. She didn't want to license it for anything, basically. And so he kind of took that, merged it with another couple of kind of abandoned projects, and then turned it into this sort of muddled concept album. So it's got no narrative cohesion. It's not a concept album in that it tells a story. It tells bits of a story. And it sort of merges 1984 with A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess and also William Burroughs, The Wild Boys. And so it's this kind of muddle. And at that time, he was also really interested in this technique that he'd learned from William Burroughs, where you write lots of lyrics and then you cut them up and you paste them together randomly. So you get these really interesting phrases that sound great, but they don't have like a coherent meaning. And so when I went back to Diamond Dogs writing this book, I was struck by the fact that there are some lyrics that precisely describe a scene from 1984, but it might be quite a minor scene. It's not the plot. He doesn't sing about Winston and Julia and so on. It might be, so it's almost as if he cut up the book and stuck bits together, and it's almost like a collage of elements of 1984. But then there's all this other sort of, there's so much going on in that record. And it was like, it was a really sort of radical response to the book, that you could just take bits and pieces of it and turn them into something that felt very modern.
You can only wonder what would have happened if he had been allowed, right? And to do, because suddenly 1984 would be already a different thing as it is today, in the sense that somehow it would be propriety of David Bowie.
I don't think he had I just don't think it would have suited him at all. I can't imagine him having the sort of narrative discipline to write an entire musical like that. It could have been terrible. It could have been really, really bad. And, you know, I think Diamond Dogs is a much more interesting and kind of irreverent response to the book, which really feels like 1974. That's the other thing. It feels incredibly of its time, and therefore kind of, you know, the best tribute to the book, because it makes the book new again.
Okay. So, and then just following the path you take in your book, and this idea that, you know, like almost, it feels to me like almost like every 10 years, there's a way to renew the ideas of 1984. So we arrived at the late 70s. There's the success of the Tory leader Margaret Thatcher, who becomes prime minister in 1979. And then suddenly 1984, you comment, has become a vessel into which anyone could pour their own version of the future. Whereas the 60s generation invoked in a spirit of defiant unity, the punks embraced the book's sense of dread. And you tell us about the Jam, This Is a Modern World, the Paul Weller, the Jam album, or the Clash references, also in his first, Joe Strummer in his first album. Tell us a little bit more about how the punk movement read or used Orwell. Do you think there's some connection in it, or just bits and pieces here and there?
Well, it's bits and pieces, but it's how it's used. I thought what was interesting is at the beginning of the decade, you've got people using Stevie Wonder and John Lennon using Big Brother as an opposition. Like Big Brother is like the man. Big Brother's like the government. It's President Nixon, whoever. So obviously you hate Big Brother.
Yeah.
Whereas in punk, you know, Paul Weller is kind of playing the part of Big Brother almost in that song. The Clash are using 1984. Oh, it's you know, it's something scary that's coming. It had more genuine fear, which was sort of truer to the book, because the idea that, you know, John Lennon would be like shaking his fist at Big Brother, that doesn't really have anything to do with the book. That's sort of not the vibe. It's almost, you needed to be more of a pessimist to do justice to the book.
It's like suddenly it's like the book is getting detached already from what 1984 means generally, right? Like, if as you were saying that, I mean, as I was quoting, sorry, that somehow any possibility of the future will be able to, you know, to fit in the ideas of 1984. Not any of it, but most of them.
Well, around the time of these punk records, you've got Thatcherite conservatives writing non-fiction books and essays, but sort of referencing or homaging 1984. And only their version of the terrifying future is because the trade unions are too strong. You know, there's just sort of, you know, the Labour Party is too strong or whatever. And so you could have people on the kind of on the far left and really on the far right, and they both would believe equally passionately that 1984 was on their side. And I think that's because Orwell was largely opposing, it was Nazism and Stalinism, but more Stalinism in the book. And so people who hate socialism can say, well, Orwell was anti-left. He calls it INGSOC. Now, Orwell was a socialist, but he was, of course, attacking the Soviet version, Soviet communism. So it's not wrong to say that he attacked the left, but he attacked a version of the left, even though he was on the left. Yes. And then people on the left go, no, Orwell only attacked that version. He was still a socialist. And also he was very aware of the threat from right-wing dictatorships, which of course he was. And so there's enough in there that, you know, that different people can claim him, even though he would not have agreed with most of them. Okay.
So now let me ask you about another fraction, let's say, of these people, which is, you know, you tell us in that Orwell said somewhere that 94 was not a prophecy, it was a satire, a parody, and a warning. So this brings me to another of the consequences of the year of 1984, which is when the film Brazil comes out by Terry Gilliam. And I'm curious to know your opinion about the humor in Orwell's novel, because it's always been said, for example, that The Castle by Kafka, it's a great piece of dark humor. And I was wondering if we could say the same about 1984, and actually if Brazil perhaps could be a good example of this implicit dark humor that has been not expanded by Orwell.
I don't think there's a lot of humor, to be honest, in 1984.
Right.
It's odd, because Orwell was a very funny writer, and there's a lot of humor in a lot of his work. I think he deliberately chose to kind of minimize it. There's a couple of, you know, there's a good sense of irony in it, but not the kind of humor that Terry Gilliam had. But it's, of course, it was sort of, you can spin it another way. You know, you can do it as a black comedy. And again, that's why, I mean, this is why you were saying Handmaid's Tale, influenced by 1984, but complete, you know, also very original and very distinctive. And similarly with Brazil, you can go, well, obviously it's taking these quite, you know, quite major ingredients from 1984, but it's the vision of Terry Gilliam and his screenwriters. And so it takes it off in a different direction. But no, I mean, even though Orwell himself had a great sense of humor and wrote some very funny lines, I think the point of 1984 was to scare people. I don't think Brazil scares people. And so I think he thought, well, if I,
well, in a way.
But it's not. No, I understand. Yes, yes. The humor, I think, would have got in the way of Orwell's mission with 1984.
Okay, so they are informing me we are getting to the end, and so I'll ask you a last question. And so when the year of 1984 arrives, there's a world phenomenon about the book, and you make reference to the launch of the first Apple computer and how Steve Jobs used the reference to Orwell's novel to advertise a different future, where screens will make a big difference. We are somehow in the time now when the fear of technology is central to understand 1984. But would you say that this was the beginning of an approach to the novel with a certain cynicism? I'm thinking how, in a way, capitalism was starting to use the novel for its own benefit, oblivious of the radical ideas. And I think they were starting to understand that the iconography of dystopia would also be something, in a way, to make money.
But I think that happened before then. It was obviously, right? It was used by, you know, like I said, the CIA, the American government used it. Obviously, different kinds of dystopian fiction were very popular in the movies. And if you look at the Apple advert, it's not really based on it. The vibe is more H.G. Wells than Orwell. You know, it's sort of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, or, you know, it's kind of, it's sort of more an idea, like a jumble of what dystopian means. And so I think that, for me, the story of 1984 is a story of a book that is constantly sort of manhandled by different political factions, by advertisers, by so on, but also by really creative writers and film directors and musicians. And I suppose what I wanted to do in the book was to go, okay, look, there's all these different versions of 1984, and there's all these different ways that people use the language and the ideas from the book. But I did just want to get down in one place. This is what actually happened. This is what Orwell thought. This is what he was trying to do. And that doesn't mean that you can't then take Big Brother or Orwellian or Thought Police and use it in a different way. But I did at least want to go, okay, well, this is what Orwell thought. You know, when he talks about Thought Police, he didn't mean political correctness, you know.
Yeah.
This is the exact things that he was sort of thinking about. He wasn't writing about computers. He didn't know. I don't think he knew computers existed yet, you know. And so I just wanted to say, okay, here is what Orwell thought about the book and what he was trying to do. And then in part two, here is what everybody else has done with the book. And I think that it's just sort of important to remember the man who wrote it and why he wrote it, because otherwise it just becomes sort of meaningless.
I see. Yeah. Well, I think that's the perfect ending for our conversation.
Cool.
And
thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And please, everyone, read Dorian Lynskey's book. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much.